She pointed a rifle at the mountain man before sunrise. But the fear in her eyes wasn't meant for him. Snow slammed against the cabin walls while Caleb Hayes pressed his bleeding shoulder against the door. Across the room, the woman he'd married 3 days earlier stood barefoot beside the stove, holding a revolver with trembling hands. Then came the sound of horses climbing the ridge outside. Slow, deliberate, getting closer through the storm. Caleb realized the quiet woman he brought home had been waiting for this moment all along. What would you do if a stranger brought danger straight to your door? Let me know where you're watching from tonight. The wind coming down from the Bitterroot Mountains carried the kind of cold that settled deep inside a man's bones and stayed there. Caleb Hayes pulled his coat tighter as his wagon rolled into Dust Creek just before sundown. Snow slushed beneath the wheels. Smoke drifted from crooked chimneys. Somewhere down the muddy main street, a piano played badly through the walls of the saloon. He hadn't been down from the ridge in nearly 4 months. Most folks pretended not to notice him. The scar along his jaw made children stare and grown men look away too quickly. Caleb preferred it that way. His horse snorted steam into the freezing air, while he tied the reins outside a narrow office wedged between the general store and a barber shop. A faded sign swung overhead, brides and domestic arrangements. Caleb stood there a long moment before stepping inside. The room smelled like lamp oil and old paper. A pot-bellied stove crackled in the corner. Behind a desk sat Mrs. Beatrice Holloway, wearing tiny spectacles low on her nose. "Well," she said, looking him over. "You actually came back." Caleb removed his gloves slowly. "Need somebody before winter closes the pass. To cook, to help around the ranch, to keep you company?" His eyes lifted toward hers. Mrs. Holloway cleared her throat. "Right. Ranch work." She opened a folder and shuffled through papers. Most women don't exactly leap at the chance to live halfway up a mountain with a man folks in town call the Wolf of Bitterroot Ridge. Caleb leaned against the wall. "Then why'd you wire me?" "Because one finally said yes." She glanced toward the back room. A woman stepped out quietly. She wore a worn blue dress beneath a dark wool coat, too thin for Montana winter. Her gloves were frayed at the fingertips. Snowmelt clung to the hem of her skirt. She couldn't have been more than 25, but it wasn't her clothes Caleb noticed first. It was the way she entered the room. Not timid, careful, like someone stepping into a place where danger might already be waiting. "Lena Brooks," Mrs. Holloway said gently. The woman nodded once, her eyes stayed lowered. Caleb studied her in silence. She was smaller than he expected. Slim, tired-looking. But there was something strange in the stillness about her. Most frightened people fidgeted. She didn't. "You understand where my ranch is?" Caleb asked. "Yes, sir." Her voice surprised him. Soft, steady. "You know there ain't neighbors for miles." "Yes, sir. Winters get rough." "I know." Mrs. Holloway slid papers across the desk. "You'll both sign here." Caleb scratched his name first. Lena hesitated only a second before signing hers. Her handwriting was neat, educated. That caught his attention. Outside, daylight faded fast as Caleb loaded her single canvas bag into the wagon. It barely weighed anything. "You got more things than this?" he asked. "No, nothing else. No blankets, no keepsakes, no extra clothes. Just the bag." The road out of Dust Creek disappeared beneath fresh snow as they climbed higher into the mountains. Pines crowded both sides of the trail. The horses breathed hard in the cold. For the first hour, neither of them spoke. Caleb kept his eyes on the road, but he noticed things. Every few minutes, Lena glanced behind them. Whenever another horse sounded in the distance, her shoulders tightened. Once, when they crossed an old bridge over frozen water, Caleb caught her pressing a hand against the canvas bag beside her, like she was checking something inside. "You expecting trouble?" he asked finally. Her eyes moved toward him, then away. "No, sir," but she answered too quickly. Night had settled fully by the time the cabin came into view through the trees. Smoke drifted from the chimney. Caleb had left banked before heading to town. Snow covered the roof, thick as wool. Lena stood still after climbing down from the wagon. The mountain silence pressed around them. Far away, a wolf howled. Caleb grabbed her bag. Come on. Storm will hit before midnight. Inside, the cabin glowed warm from lantern light and the iron stove. One table, one bed, a wash basin near the wall. Shelves lined with canned peaches, flour sacks, coffee tins, and hunting tools. Lena looked at everything carefully, not admiring, measuring. You can sleep near the stove, Caleb said. Blankets are in the chest. She nodded. While he unpacked supplies, she moved quietly around the room, touching nothing she didn't need to. She hung her coat carefully beside the door, rolled her sleeves, started coffee without asking where things were. That caught his eye too. You done this before? He asked. A long time ago. The storm arrived near midnight. Wind hammered the cabin walls. Snow hissed against the windows. Caleb slept lightly these days. Too many winters alone could do that to a man. A sound woke him, not loud, just floorboards creaking. He opened his eyes slowly. Lena stood near the front window in darkness lit only by moonlight reflecting off snow. One hand pulled the curtain aside slightly. The other held a small revolver hidden against her arm. Caleb sat up quietly. Miss Brooks. She spun fast enough that the gun almost came up with her. For a second, neither moved. Then she lowered it. I heard something outside. She whispered. Caleb stared at the revolver. Thought you said you were a seamstress. I am. Seamstresses usually sleep with sewing needles, not Colt pistols. The wind groaned through the trees. Lena looked back toward the black window. Her face had gone pale. Caleb rose slowly from the bed. Who are you afraid of? She didn't answer. Not a single word. The next morning, Caleb stepped outside before sunrise to break ice from the water trough. Then he stopped. Fresh tracks circled the cabin. Horse tracks. 3 riders. Watching the ranch sometime during the night. Caleb slowly lifted his eyes toward the tree line. The mountains stood silent beneath the snow. Behind him, the cabin door creaked open. Lena stepped outside, holding 2 cups of coffee. The moment she saw Caleb staring at the tracks, the color drained from her face. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Wind moved softly through the pines behind the cabin. Snow squeaked beneath Caleb's boots as he crouched beside the prince. 3 horses, heavy riders. One of them had stopped close enough to the barn to spit tobacco into the snow. These weren't here last night, Caleb said quietly. Lena tightened both hands around the coffee cups. Steam curled past her face. You know who they are? No, but she answered without looking at him. Caleb straightened slowly. Whoever they are, they came a long way up this ridge in the middle of a storm. Folks don't do that for sightseeing. Lena swallowed hard. One of the horses in the stable stamped nervously. She flinched at the sound before catching herself. Caleb noticed. He noticed everything. The rest of the morning passed under a strange silence. Caleb repaired a loose hinge on the corral gate while Lena swept snow away from the front steps with an old broom made from tied brush reeds. Smoke drifted from the chimney into the gray winter sky. By noon, the cold sharpened. Lena stood at the kitchen table, patching the elbow of Caleb's work coat. Her stitches were small and clean, tighter than anything he'd ever seen done in Dust Creek. You sew like somebody taught you proper, Caleb said from the stove. My mother did. You from Montana? No, she didn't offer more. Caleb sipped black coffee from a chipped tin cup. You always answer questions like they cost money. That almost pulled a smile from her. Almost. Outside, snow began falling again. Thick flakes this time. Toward evening, Caleb headed to the stable carrying a lantern. Lena followed, without being asked. The horses calmed quicker when she spoke softly to them. That surprised him, too. Most strangers got kicked trying to handle old Jasper, the gray gelding in the back stall. But Lena rubbed the horse slowly between the eyes until the animal rested its head against her shoulder. Well, Caleb muttered, guess he likes you better than me. The horse suddenly grabbed the edge of Caleb's coat sleeve with its teeth and yanked hard. Lena laughed before she could stop herself. A real laugh, warm, quick, gone almost immediately. But Caleb heard it. He looked over at her. She lowered her eyes fast, embarrassed by the sound like it had escaped accidentally. For the first time since bringing her to the mountain, the cabin didn't feel quite so empty. That night they ate venison stew beside the fire while wind rattled the windows. Lena barely touched the meat in her bowl. Caleb pretended not to notice. Later, after she stepped outside to bring in extra firewood, he quietly slid half his portion into her bowl. When she came back in and saw it, her eyes lifted toward him. "I'm not hungry," he lied. Lena studied him for a second. Then she sat down and ate slowly without another word. 3 days passed that way. Snow, wood smoke, quiet routines. Lena learned where Caleb kept the coffee grounds, the salt pork, the lantern oil. Caleb learned she woke before sunrise every morning and checked the window before touching breakfast. Sometimes he caught her staring down toward the valley road like she expected riders to appear at any moment. Down in Dust Creek, the story had already started spreading. Harland Pike, owner of Pike Valley Bank, had nailed a notice outside the general store, offering reward money for information about a missing woman tied to stolen financial documents. Folks talked about it over poker tables and whiskey glasses. Most assumed she'd already frozen to death somewhere. But Boone Keller didn't think so. Boone rode with 2 hard-looking men up the logging trail north of town while snow drifted through the trees around them. His beard carried frost clear to his collar. "You really think she's up here?" one of the gunmen asked. Boone adjusted the rifle across his saddle. "Women running alone usually head for crowds. Then why the mountains? Because this one's smarter than most." Back on Wolf Ridge, Caleb split wood beside the cabin while Lena hung damp clothes near the stove. The axe slipped suddenly on frozen grain. The blade glanced sideways and sliced across Caleb's palm. He hissed sharply. Blood spotted the snow. Before he could react, Lena was already beside him. "Sit down." Her voice came fast and firm. Caleb blinked. She pulled a clean strip of cloth from her apron pocket, wrapped his hand tight, then twisted the fabric with practiced pressure until the bleeding slowed. "You learned that sewing too?" he asked. Lena tied the knot carefully. No, she realized too late how much she'd revealed. Caleb looked at her differently after that. Not suspicious exactly, more curious. That evening he watched her sharpen a kitchen knife against stone with smooth, even strokes. Not like somebody guessing, like somebody taught to keep blades ready. "You ever live somewhere dangerous?" he asked quietly. Lena's hand stopped for half a second, then continued. "Yes." Outside, darkness settled over Wolf Ridge. The storm came after midnight. Wind screamed through the pines hard enough to shake the cabin walls. Snow piled against the porch. Caleb woke suddenly to a sound beneath the storm. Horses, running hard. Then came another sound. Closer, men shouting. Lena sat upright instantly near the stove, eyes wide in the dark. Caleb grabbed the shotgun hanging beside the door, and then, boom, the stable doors exploded inward from a shotgun blast. The horses inside began screaming and kicking against their stalls. Caleb shoved the cabin door open into a wall of snow and wind. Cold hit him hard enough to steal his breath. Lantern light swung wildly from the stable, throwing long shadows across the yard. "Stay inside," he barked. Lena was already pulling on her boots. Another gunshot cracked through the storm. Wood splintered beside the corral. Caleb raised the shotgun and fired once towards the tree line. The blast echoed off the mountains. One of the horses broke loose inside the stable and slammed against the side gate. "Easy," Caleb shouted, running toward them. Snow swallowed sound fast, but he still heard men moving out there. Boots crunching. A low whistle somewhere near the pines. Not amateurs, hunters. Jasper reared inside the stable, eyes rolling white. Caleb grabbed the reins hanging from the stall post and tried calming the animal before it snapped a leg in the panic. Then the rifle shot came. The impact spun him sideways. Pain tore through his shoulder, hot and sudden. Caleb hit the snow hard. For a second, the world went silent except for the ringing in his ears. He looked down. Blood already soaked through his coat. Somewhere beyond the storm, a man laughed. Thought mountain men were harder to kill than that. Boone Keller stepped from behind the trees, holding a Winchester rifle low against his chest. Snow clung to his beard and hat brim. Two other riders spread out behind him. "Where is she?" Boone called. Caleb tried lifting the shotgun, but his arm barely worked. Boots crunched closer. Then another sound split the night. A rifle cracked from above the stable roof. One of Boone's men cried out and dropped behind the water trough, clutching his arm. Everybody froze. Another shot. Closer this time. Precise. The lantern hanging beside the stable burst apart in sparks and darkness. Boone dove sideways into the snow. Caleb looked up through the storm. Lena stood on the stable roof with a rifle braced against her shoulder. Her hair whipped loose in the wind. Snow gathered across her coat sleeves. Her face looked completely different now. Not frightened, focused. "Move," she shouted down at Caleb. That voice stopped him colder than the weather. Not soft anymore, commanding. Boone fired upward. Bullets punched through wood near her boots. Lena answered instantly. One clean shot forced Boone behind the trough again. Then she slid off the roof, landed hard in the snow beside Caleb, and grabbed him beneath the good arm. "Get up. You can shoot," he muttered through clenched teeth. Later. Blood dripped steadily from his shoulder into the snow as she half dragged him toward the storage shed beside the cabin. Wind slammed the door behind them. Inside smelled like hay, saddle leather, and cold pine. Lena shoved an old crate beneath him. "Take the coat off." Caleb stared at her. "You heard me." She was already opening cabinets, pulling down whiskey, thread, clean cloth, a curved sewing needle from a small tin kit. "You done this before?" Caleb asked. Lena glanced once toward the door where gunshots still cracked outside. Yes, she cut through the coat sleeve with a hunting knife. Blood sped dark beneath the lantern glow. "The bullet passed through," she said quickly. "That's good. Don't feel good. No, it won't." She poured whiskey directly over the wound. Caleb sucked air hard through his teeth and nearly blacked out. "Hold still." Her hands moved fast, efficient, not guessing where to place pressure or how tight to pull the cloth. She stitched like somebody who'd done it in bad places before. Outside, Boone shouted through the storm. "You hiding a killer in there, Hayes?" Lena's jaw tightened slightly. Caleb noticed that too. "You know him?" "Yes." The needle passed through skin again. "You want to explain why armed men climbed a mountain to find a seamstress?" Lena tied off the stitch carefully, then finally looked at him straight. "I'm not just a seamstress." Snow rattled hard against the shed roof. She sat back slowly, rifle resting beside her knee. "I worked for Harland Pike," she said quietly. "At the bank in Dust Creek." Caleb frowned. "Doing books?" "Yes. And I found records he didn't want found." Her eyes lowered briefly toward the floor. Land deeds, forged debt papers, ranches stolen from families who couldn't pay loans he created himself. Caleb stared at her silently. Cowboys, settlers, colored families, widows. Her voice flattened. Anybody too poor to fight him. Outside, another horse screamed. Lena continued anyway. "I copied the records, took them. Pike found out. She swallowed once. Boone Keller works for him now." Caleb leaned back against the crate, breathing hard. "The paper's here." She nodded. "Where?" "Safe enough." Boone's voice thundered outside again. "Last chance, Hayes." A shotgun blast slammed into the cabin wall nearby. Lena picked up the rifle calmly and checked the chamber. "You killed anybody before?" Caleb asked quietly. She didn't answer immediately. Then, "Yes." The wind groaned through the cracks in the wood. Caleb looked at her differently now. Not weak, not frightened. Dangerous in ways he hadn't understood. But sitting there beside him in lantern light with blood on her hands, she still looked tired more than cruel. Like somebody who'd been running too long. Caleb's head dipped from blood loss. Lena caught his jaw suddenly and forced him to look at her. "No." Her voice dropped low. "You don't get to die on me now." For a second, neither moved. The storm outside faded beneath the sound of his breathing. Then, somewhere behind the stable, came the sharp crash of breaking wood. Lena turned instantly toward the sound. Caleb grabbed the lantern and saw it too through the gap in the boards. The backside of the stable had been torn open. Someone was searching inside, not for horses, for something hidden. Caleb pushed himself upright, despite the fire burning through his shoulder. Outside, the storm had started turning meaner. Wind drove snow sideways through the broken stable wall, covering the floorboards in white. Lena moved first. She blew out the lantern with 2 fingers and pulled Caleb lower beside the crates. Darkness swallowed the shed except for thin moonlight leaking through the gaps in the wood. Boot steps creaked outside, slow, careful. Not Boone this time, somebody searching. Caleb reached for the shotgun leaning beside the wall, but his injured arm shook hard enough to betray him. Lena noticed and quietly slid the rifle into her own hands instead. The footsteps stopped near the stable. Then came the sound of wood being pried apart. A low curse. "He's looking under the floor," Lena whispered. Caleb frowned. "There's a floor compartment?" She nodded once. "Old feeds storage." Another board snapped outside. Lena's breathing stayed steady, but Caleb caught the tightness in her jaw. Whatever sat beneath those boards mattered more than the ranch itself. The stranger outside muttered again. "Boone, I found Summeth." The rifle cracked. The man dropped instantly behind the stable wall with a heavy thud. Silence followed. Then Boone Keller shouted from somewhere near the trees. "You just signed your own grave, girl." Gunfire exploded through the storm again. Bullets punched through the shed walls, showering splinters over them. Lena grabbed Caleb beneath the arm. "Move." They stumbled out through the back into waist-deep snow behind the cabin. Wind roared across Wolf Ridge. Caleb nearly lost his footing twice before Lena steadied him without a word. The mountains around them looked endless and black beneath the storm clouds. Far below, the Bitterroot Valley disappeared under snow and darkness. Lena led him toward the narrow ravine behind the ranch where old pine trees leaned over the trail like crooked church pillars. Hidden beneath one of the rocks sat a small iron box wrapped in oilcloth. She dug it out quickly. Caleb stared at her. "That's what they came for." "Yes. You buried it here the whole time?" "I didn't know if I could trust you yet." The words should have stung more than they did, maybe because she looked ashamed saying them. Another shot echoed nearby. Boone's men were spreading uphill now. Caleb looked down at the box. "What's inside?" Enough proof to hang Harland Pike. For a moment neither moved. Snow collected in Lena's hair and across Caleb's coat collar. Somewhere behind them, the stable roof groaned loudly from the fire starting to catch. Caleb turned. Orange light flickered through the storm. "They burned the ranch," he said quietly. Lena looked back too. The flames reflected in her eyes, soft and terrible at the same time. "I'm sorry." It was the first time she'd said those words to him. Caleb stared at the burning stable for another second before answering. "Ain't your fault men like Pike exist." The fire spread fast through the dry pine walls. Horses screamed again from inside the corral. Without thinking, Caleb started forward. Lena grabbed his coat hard. "You'll bleed out. My horses are in there." Before she could stop him, he pushed through the snow toward the flames. Heat slammed against the cold air in violent waves. Caleb forced open the side gate while smoke rolled into his face. One frightened mare burst free past him into the storm. Another horse kicked wildly against tangled reins. Caleb coughed hard, fighting. Dizziness. Then Lena appeared beside him with a blanket wrapped over her mouth. Together they cut loose the remaining horses and drove them into the ravine away from the fire. By the time the last horse disappeared into the trees, Caleb could barely stand. Lena caught him before he collapsed. For a second, her hand stayed against his chest longer than necessary. Close enough for him to feel how cold her fingers were. Close enough for her to hear his breathing. The storm softened briefly around them. Then a voice echoed down from the ridge above. "You got nowhere left to run." Boone stood near the rocks with 2 gunmen beside him. Snow whipped around their coats. And beside Boone, Harland Pike himself stepped forward under a black wool coat, holding a silver-handled revolver. The banker's face looked calm, almost bored. "I warned you what happens to thieves," Pike called down. Lena's entire body went still beside Caleb. Pike glanced toward the burning ranch. "Shame about the place, Hayes. Especially considering your family never legally owned it anyway." Caleb stared upward. "What?" Pike smiled faintly. "Your brother found out before he died." The wind seemed to stop. Even Boone glanced sideways at Pike after saying it. Caleb's face tightened slowly. "You lying bastard." "Am I?" Pike said. "Ask yourself why the herd route suddenly changed that winter. Why your brother was riding alone during the stampede." Caleb gripped the shotgun so hard his knuckles whitened despite the blood loss. Something dark moved behind his eyes then. Old grief waking back up. Pike tipped his hat slightly. "Burn the rest." The gunmen raised their rifles. Lena grabbed Caleb's arm. "Run." This time he didn't argue. Together they disappeared deeper into the storm while fire climbed higher behind them on Wolf Ridge. Snow swallowed their tracks almost as fast as they made them. Caleb stumbled beside Lena through narrow pine trails buried under ice and wind-blown drifts. His injured shoulder had soaked half his coat dark. Every few steps he pressed a hand against the wound like he could hold himself together through stubbornness alone. Behind them, faint voices echoed through the storm. Boone's men were still coming. Lena led Caleb toward the abandoned silver mine near the upper ridge. The old miners had blasted tunnels through the mountain 20 years earlier before the veins dried up. Folks in Dust Creek said the place was cursed now. Too many cave-ins, too many bodies never recovered. Tonight it looked like the only shelter left in Montana. The mine entrance sat hidden behind crooked cedar trees and sheets of hanging ice. Lena dragged loose boards aside while Caleb leaned heavily against the rock wall, breathing steam into the freezing air. Inside, darkness wrapped around them instantly. The smell hit first. Cold earth, wet stone, rusted iron. Lena lit a small oil lamp from her satchel. The weak flame revealed old rail tracks disappearing deeper underground beside broken ore carts covered in dust. Caleb lowered himself slowly onto a crate. For a long moment, neither spoke. Outside, wind screamed across the mountain like something alive. Lena knelt beside him and carefully peeled back the bloody bandage on his shoulder. Her hands stayed steady even after everything that had happened. "You still carrying thread?" Caleb asked weakly. She almost smiled. "Always." She poured whiskey over the wound again. Caleb hissed through his teeth and turned his face toward the dark tunnel wall. "You cuss less than most men," Lena murmured while threading the needle. "My brother used to do enough cussing for both of us." The words slipped out before he meant them to. Lena paused only a second before continuing the stitches. Caleb stared quietly at the flickering lantern light. "I should been riding point that day," he said. "Storm came early. Horses got spooked near the ravine." His jaw tightened. "Ellie got trapped underneath 3 of them before I could reach him." The mine fell silent, except for the soft pull of thread through skin. "He kept yelling my name," Caleb said softly. "That's the part that never leaves." Lena tied off the stitch carefully. Then, without speaking, she slid his coat closer to the fire so it could dry. No speeches, no pity, just understanding. After a while, she sat beside the lantern with the iron box in her lap. Caleb watched her fingers rest on the lid. "My father had land outside Tulsa," she said quietly. "Not much, just enough for horses and peach trees." She stared at the box without opening it. Harland Pike's men forged debt papers after a drought year. Took everything. Caleb looked over at her. "He fight back?" He tried. The silence afterward answered the rest. Outside, a distant gunshot echoed through the storm. Both of them froze. Then came another sound. Closer this time. Boots crunching snow near the mine entrance. Lena blew out the lantern instantly. Darkness swallowed them whole. Caleb reached for the shotgun beside the crate, while Lena moved closer to the tunnel wall, rifle raised toward the entrance. A faint orange glow appeared outside. Torchlight. Boone's voice carried through the wind. "They're in here." The footsteps multiplied. Caleb leaned toward Lena in the darkness. "You know another way out?" "There's an old tunnel lower down," she whispered. "If it hasn't collapsed." "And if it has?" Lena glanced toward him even though he could barely see her face. "Then we make our stand here." For a second neither moved. The mountain groaned softly around them as wind pressed against the old mine timbers. Then Caleb reached over and found her hand in the dark, not gripping hard, just enough. "You're the first thing that's felt like home since my brother died," he said quietly. Lena's breath caught. Before she could answer, a thunderous blast shook the mountain. Dust rained from the ceiling beams. The mine entrance exploded inward in a storm of shattered rock and snow. Boone Keller had found the dynamite. And maybe that's the moment this story stopped being about survival. Because somewhere between the burning ranch, the frozen mountains, and the silence inside that dark mine, Caleb and Lena stopped running from the lives that had broken them. They became two wounded people choosing, again and again, not to leave the other behind. If you really think about it, most folks carry a winter like that somewhere inside them. Maybe not a gunfight on a mountain ridge, maybe not outlaws or blizzards, but grief, regret, the feeling that one terrible moment ruined the rest of your life. And maybe that's why Caleb matters. Because even after losing his brother, even after burying himself away from the world, he still found room in his heart to protect someone else. And Lena matters because she never stopped fighting to become more than the fear chasing her. Sometimes healing doesn't come all at once. Sometimes it looks like a lantern left burning in a cabin window, a cup of coffee waiting on the stove, a hand reaching for yours in the dark when you thought nobody would ever stay. If this story stayed with you tonight, tell me where you're listening from. And if you enjoy these quiet Western stories about love, loss, and second chances beneath wide American skies, stay a while. There are still more trails ahead, and more souls waiting around the next firelight.